What we're going to talk about today is the need for a new youth leadership to build an international fight against racism and to take on the issue of climate change as that. You know, and it's going to take the people in this room stepping forward as leaders of this new movement. And what we want to do, hold on. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to have opening remarks by Tony Gard, who is a leader of the Civil Rights and Immigrants' Rights Group Movement for Justice by Any Means Necessary. That's BAMN's sister organization in the UK. He's going to talk about the politics of, the current politics of climate change, like the negotiations and, like how the powers that be have completely failed us, the people in this room, and this planet. I'm going to speak about the opportunities that we have now, in this new period of struggle for young people to really take the lead. And then Ed's going to finish up with the perspective for people in this room and, for people occupying downtown San Francisco and occupying the college campuses and high school students the nation over for, how we move forward to really tackle this issue. And so I'm hoping that, we'll have 15, 20 minutes for discussion at the end. We definitely want to hear from everybody. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tom. Thanks very much.
Welcome to BAMN, the Independent Integrated Civil Rights Movement, and welcome to the room with the largest number of security guards at the door in the conference. When you get the biggest number of security guards, I always like that because it shows that you're powerful. And power is the main thing I'm going to be talking about today. I want to dive straight in because we're a little bit late starting. A few weeks ago, I read a talk by a man whose name I've forgotten, I'm afraid, but is the head of the United States Meteorological Service. And the Meteorological Services, people often think of them as the people who do the weather forecasting every day. But actually they do much more than that, and they're one of the main agencies that study climate change. And the head of the US Meteorological Service in this talk made, I think, a very important and a very good statement. He said, first of all, climate change is an established fact. We know it's happening. Global warming is happening. That's an established fact. There's no point in arguing about it. And then he went on to say, and because it's an established fact, we recognize that. It is just stupid of scientists to keep saying we can't prove that this, that, or the other individual weather event is caused by climate change. It may or may not be. That's simply silly, because if climate change is happening, global warming is happening, that's global. That means it's all connected with everything else. All these things are connected. And so any event that takes place is going to be affected by climate change. So, yeah, hurricanes have been happening since, God knows, I know, millions of years probably. But hurricanes have been happening for as long as there have been people in the world, certainly. And they go on happening. But what's happening is that those hurricanes are getting fiercer. They're getting stronger. Hurricane Katrina was just what happened in New Orleans was an example of that. So it's silly to say we can't say whether Hurricane Katrina was or was not a result of climate change. Hurricanes are getting stronger. That's what it means. A hurricane would have happened anyway. It's the strength and fierceness of the events, what's called extreme weather events. And you've had a lot of those in the United States in the last 2 years. I don't need to enumerate those for you. But then this guy, the head of the US Meteorological Service, went on to make another point. Those were his scientific points. But then he went to go on a completely different point. And he said, we've got to be realistic. I'm not giving his exact words, but we've got to be realistic. We've got to be realistic in what we're asking the government to do. We can't go beyond what is possible for the economic system, I think was probably the word that he used, meaning the big corporations and so on, and the banks, and what the politicians are able to accept. And so we've got to be realistic in what we're asking for. Now, in my book, being realistic means that if you know that there's a problem, that there's a serious problem, and that it's going to get worse, and you know that there are things that can be done about it, then you make sure those things get done. That's being realistic. And there's something that's often called the prudential principle. That means if you know that some things are going to happen and they're going to get worse, but you're not actually sure just when they're going to happen or when they're going to get worse, you don't wait around until after they've happened. You prepare for the worst, and you prepare for it as quickly as possible. That's what the whole insurance industry is based on. Okay? And that's what most people do in their lives, if they've got any sense. If you live in a house made all of wood in a dry area of the country, then you make sure you've got plenty of smoke alarms and you've got good fire insurance. And if somebody comes along and finds out that you've not, one of your friends finds out you've not, your friend would consider it their responsibility to urge you to get some good fire insurance. That's common sense, and that's what the prudential principle means. And we're saying that's what should be applied to climate change. We know that it's happening. We know that it's going to get more serious. We can't predict exactly when any particular things are going to happen, but we apply some common sense to the situation and we prepare. That's realism. So what is this? What did the head of the... There's a clash. When the head of the Meteorological Service was saying that we have to be realistic in what we're asking for, there was a clash between what he was saying as a scientist and what he was saying really as a politician, because that was not a scientific judgment that he was giving when he talked about being realistic. It was a political judgment. So my first and most important point of all, and if you don't remember anything else, remember this: the climate change debate is not simply a question of science, right? And it's not a scientific debate. It's fundamentally a political debate. That's the first point I wanted to make. Now, then I want to come on and talk about why is it so difficult for somebody like that scientist to speak out and say, this is very, very dangerous, and we've got to be getting on the rooftops and shouting to everybody to shake the government and shake the corporations and tell them they've got to change. Because they're not, the scientific leaders aren't doing that. Because I think they feel that the politicians aren't going to move and that the corporations are not going to move. I'll come back to why the scientists feel that way in a minute, but I do feel we have to say something about why the corporations won't move. Why won't they adopt the prudential principle? Why won't they use some common sense over this? I think we have to say it's because they are so totally tied to carbon. The Industrial Revolution 200 years ago was built on coal. It was built on burning carbon that you dig out of the ground. And essentially, it's the same economy now. They've added oil and gas, but it's still carbon. They're still fossil fuels. And the world economy is tied at the moment to burning fossil fuels. And the more fossil fuels you burn, the more carbon dioxide and other heat-trapping gases you pump into the atmosphere. And because those gases trap heat in the atmosphere, it gets warmer. Yeah? And that leads to all the other consequences we're seeing: more extreme weather, worse droughts and worse floods, and so on and so forth. And I wanted to compare that with another problem that the governments and the corporations did do something about in order to try and show the difference. About 20, 30 years ago, there was a lot of fuss about the hole in the ozone layer. The ozone layer is a layer of a gas called ozone high up in the atmosphere. And what that does is to block all the ultraviolet rays that come in from the sun. And if you spend a long time sunbathing on a beach on a hot sunny day, you get sunburned. That's essentially because of the ultraviolet rays, and that's what gives you skin cancer and so on, is the ultraviolet rays. Now, if the ozone layer broke down, there'd be vastly more ultraviolet light coming through to the world, and agriculture would become very difficult, cancer rates would soar, and so on and so forth. And scientists were saying to the politicians and the corporations that this is very dangerous. And they did fix it. It took a bit of a delay. Some of the same people now who are denying climate change were then denying the role of the ozone layer. But essentially the politicians told them to shut the hell up because they didn't want to get skin cancer, and they didn't want to see the agriculture shriveling up. So the people who were producing these particular chemicals that were causing damage to the ozone layer, things that were used in refrigerators and aerosol sprays, they said, you've got to find something else. And they did very quickly find some other substitutes that they could use. Now that they could do easily because it was a small fix. It was just one little industry and one little group of chemicals, and it was fairly easy to find substitutes. But the problem with carbon is everything is built on it. All the investments, not just in oil and gas extraction, but in manufacturing, in motors, in transport, in power stations, and everything is based on that. So it would mean a very big rejigging of the economy to change it. If they did that, they'd have to forego a lot of profits. That's really what it means. They would have to forego a lot of profits and privilege. They would have to accept not being as rich as they used to be. And they're not prepared to accept that, and they're saying to the politicians, this won't work, and if we did it in America, then, okay, China's not going to stop, or Brazil's not going to stop, or India's not going to stop. And that's why they're all saying, and they're doing this in different countries, no, we can't do anything about climate change. It's too dangerous. It's too dangerous to our profits. So it is a question of whether you put people and nature before profits, or profits before people and nature. That's what it comes down to. Now, on the question about the role of scientists, 30 or 40 years ago, there was a very famous scientist in the 1960s and 70s called Rachel Carson. She was a scientist, and she understood that the pesticides that were being pumped into the atmosphere by the agricultural and chemical industries were causing enormous damage to wildlife and to human beings and so on. That these were very dangerous substances. And she didn't just produce research papers and give them to politicians. She knew that would take too long. She wrote books and articles which were easy for people to grasp and understand. And she went out and spoke to ordinary people and mobilized people. And that was really the first thing that launched the big environmental campaign in the United States. And they did win some victories. They did ban DDT and a whole number of other dangerous chemicals. She was a scientist who saw her job of understanding science as something that needed to when she saw the truth, she had to get that out to people and mobilize them. And that's actually also how the movement around climate change started. Climate change scientists in the 1970s and 1980s weren't waiting for the politicians. They started to organise. They organised their own conferences internationally. They organised their own kind of campaign committees, you could almost call them. Something called the Working Group on Greenhouse Gases. And they had conferences where they worked out what kind of reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases had got to be made to stop global warming becoming dangerous. And they got the Canadian government to call a conference in 1988 in Toronto to plan for that, to actually organise those cuts. But by then, the corporations were becoming aware of what the scientists were doing, and they were going to the politicians and they're saying, these people are dangerous. And the politicians basically took over that conference. So that conference, the scientists were a small minority. It was stuffed full of politicians and government officials and people representing the industries and so on, and they basically ditched the advice that the scientists were giving them and settled for something much lower. And that's been the story ever since. The scientists were pushed on one side, and the politicians became their own climate change forecasters. They became like, you know, you wouldn't ask a politician to give you the weather forecast for the next week, but these people, these politicians have basically decided they'll give you the weather forecast for the next century. And they're saying it's not too dangerous, we can go ahead burning carbon. That's what that's what they're doing. They're setting the agenda, taking it away from the people who really know. The problem for the people who really know is that they had relied on rational arguments convincing the rich and powerful. And that never works. What convinces the rich and powerful is when their power is threatened. It's mass movements, it's struggle, it's mobilising masses of people saying we won't put up with this anymore. And the scientists got stuck in this bubble, like they couldn't see the rest of society, they could only see the rich and powerful, and they were focused on presidents and prime ministers and on the heads, chief executives of corporations, thinking that they would eventually see reason and do something about it. And this led to something called the Kyoto Agreement, which came in 1997, and was an agreement to set some targets on greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the first thing to say, these greenhouse gas emissions these limits were ridiculously low. They simply weren't going to work. They were totally inadequate. But secondly, the United States, the biggest economy and the biggest polluter in the world, never signed up to them. And this treaty runs, and it's never worked. Almost every country in the world has exceeded those targets. So that treaty runs out next year. And 2 years ago in Copenhagen, almost exactly 2 years ago in December 2009, there was a conference which was supposed to prepare the alternative. And because this was right after George Bush ceased to become president and Obama was elected, there were tremendous hopes around the world that this time something would actually get done. Nothing got done at that conference. Nothing got done. The conference collapsed. Nothing was decided at all. Nothing was voted on at all. No agreement came out of it. Here's why. And this, I think, is something that we have to, a lot of people don't understand. A lot of people will tell you, oh, it was bad judgment, or there were a lot of mistakes, or it was all a model. It wasn't a model. The people who caused that conference to collapse knew what they were doing. And the people were the Chinese government and the US administration. The Kyoto conference was not a conference in reality that had anything to do with climate change. It was about the power relations and economic relations between the United States and China. the two biggest economies in the world and the two biggest polluters in the world. And the United States wanted to save what it can of its past global leadership, and China, which is galloping ahead as a great capitalist power, wanted to get more room to expand and grow. And so the deal was essentially that we will ditch Kyoto. China didn't say that, but that's what they agreed to do. America didn't exactly say that, but that's what they agreed to do. We'll ditch Kyoto, and we won't have any limits. We won't set any internationally agreed limits. We will just say that every country will just let us know what they're going to do. Every country can just make up its own forecast and set its own limits. And because these meant nobody set any limits. Most countries actually set limits which would mean that they could actually emit more carbon into the atmosphere than they've been doing previously. And it's not just America and China did that. The European countries, who like to present themselves like Britain, like my country does, as being all green and environmentally friendly, set themselves carbon limits which they know they can easily, will allow them to exceed what they've been doing already. But the main thing was this deal between the US and China, that the US would allow China to steam ahead and burn as much coal as it needed to do in order to expand its economy, and America and China would let America do the same. And that was a deal. Now, what this means is that they're saying, and this is the next big point that I think, this is, if anything, the point that people are most hostile when they hear us, BAMN and Movement for Justice, make this point. That this was a profoundly racist agreement. Because what it meant was saying to small island countries in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, like the Maldive Islands, which are going to go under the rising sea levels within 10 to 20 years, you can drown. You can drown. Your nations will cease to exist. There will be perhaps a dozen or 20 fewer countries represented in the United Nations. They'll all have to go and live somewhere else. Okay? But it's saying to most of the countries of Africa, of South and Central America, of Southeast Asia, of Pakistan and Bangladesh, you are heading for catastrophes, and we are allowing that to happen. And one delegate at that conference had the guts to get up and say that, to say, and this was a delegate from Sudan in Africa, a country that's going to be very badly hit by climate change. This is a decision to let Africa burn, and it's a decision to adopt the same policies that sent 6 million Jewish people to the gas chambers in Europe in the 1940s. In other words, it's a racist policy. It's a racist policy. If you're saying that black and brown people in Africa and Asia and Latin America don't count for as much as people, white people in Europe or North America, that is saying that those people are inferior and don't matter. And I can't think of any word to describe that other than racism. And we have to say that, because it's those countries all along that have stood up for the science. The people who were the best allies for the scientists at Copenhagen and way back to the 1970s were those poor countries who knew they were going to suffer most. And they've been the best defenders of the science. Not the USA, not Britain, not Germany, not Russia. And so we have to bear that in mind. But it also points us to where our power is. It's those countries, but it's also the black and Asian and Latin American communities in Europe and in North America. Communities which have close links with those countries and are also going to suffer in these countries. Because the elite in America and in Britain and in Europe think that they can probably survive. They won't be too badly affected. They'll survive somehow. But they know that there are a lot of poor people in their countries who won't survive in the same way, who are going to find life a lot more difficult. And we've seen signs of that already. Who has suffered from the wildfires and the drought and the tornadoes and hurricanes in the United States over the last 2 years? Who suffered from Katrina? It was poor people and black people and Latino people overwhelmingly. It wasn't rich, upper middle class white people. It wasn't the heads of the corporation or the government. And that's true everywhere you look in the so-called developed world. So it's going to affect all of us. The best allies for any scientists who are prepared to come out are going to be the poor, working people, black and Asian and other, and Latino and other ethnic minority communities, and most of all, young people. Because that is that's what will inspire the scientists, the best of the scientists, to feel that they can and have to make a stand. We need a new generation of Rachel Carsons, but we, and I'm talking about people in BAMN and in the Movement for Justice in Britain, in other young environmentalist organisations in other countries, need to encourage those Rachel Carsons, those new Rachel Carsons, to step forward. Now, I want to finish by saying something very immediate about the situation in the United States. I think there's been a big, very important development this year in the fight against the KXL pipeline. The pipeline that's going to take oil and gas from the tar sands in northern Canada near the Arctic and bring it down to the refineries on the Gulf of Mexico. Now, those tar sands are the most dangerous and polluting form of extracting oil that you can imagine. They're very, very dangerous. And they will emit much, much more carbon dioxide into the oil from that exploitation of those tar sands. This campaign against the pipeline could kill that project, because if they can't get that, if they can't get that pipeline down to the oil refineries on the Gulf of Mexico, they really can't develop the tar sands, because it would cost too much to develop a whole lot of new infrastructure and oil refineries up in the Arctic. So you kill that pipeline, you kill that very dangerous polluting project. And I don't think all the environmentalists who have delayed the pipeline now fully realise just how big a victory they scored, but also they need to realise how fragile their victory is. Because the political advisors, there were people in the Democratic Party leadership who were saying, okay, we'd better stall this till after the election, and then we go ahead with it. And I can guarantee you, whoever gets elected from whatever party after the presidential election, they will sign that deal unless it's stopped now. And it's going to be young people. It was young people who stopped it. What happened was college students who turned out around the White House back in August, and many of them got arrested by the police, went back to their college campuses at the beginning of the new semester, and they started campaigning. And many of them organised groups to go out to the Midwest, where two things were happening. The pipeline was going to be built, but there was the worst drought in living memory, and super record heat waves. And so people you talk to them about climate change, they can say, oh yeah, we can see that's true. And they were prepared to organise community-based campaigns against the pipeline. And there were votes in that. And so they put it off till after the election. But it can be killed if young people and scientists get together and speak the plain truth and mobilise mass action. Use the election campaign. Go to every election meeting. Make a great noise at every televised presidential debate. go to the party congresses, go to the conventions of the autumn, do what the anti-Vietnam War movement did in 1968 and absolutely shut down the Democratic Party conference. That was a big turning point for the fight to stop the war in Vietnam. We can do that with the war, with the war against the tar sands. So young people have got to step forward, and the Rachel Carsons have got to step forward, and we can win. But that's what it's going to take.